Ferrari, their fall in 1980 is the kind of story that feels almost impossible to believe today. Just 1 year earlier, the prancing horse was on top of the world. Jody Scheckter had clinched the Drivers' Championship in 1979, with Gilles Villeneuve right behind him, and Ferrari had taken the Constructors' crown. They were supposed to be untouchable. The red cars roaring down the straights, the Tifosi waving flags in Monza, the legacy of Enzo Ferrari still burning bright. But then came the 312 T5. On paper, it was meant to be a natural evolution of the previous car, but in practice, it was hopelessly outdated. While rivals like Williams, Lotus, and Brabham mastered ground effect aerodynamics, Ferrari clung to their flat 12 engine and traditional design philosophy. The result was a car that looked the part but had none of the speed. The 312 T5 was overweight, thirsty on fuel, and absolutely no match for the new generation of downforce heavy machines. The humiliation hit hard. Gilles Villeneuve, one of the most talented drivers to ever sit in a Ferrari, could barely drag the car into the points. His brilliance was wasted trying to keep up with midfield runners. And Scheckter, the reigning world champion, endured a nightmare. The low point came at the Canadian Grand Prix, when Scheckter failed to even qualify. A Ferrari, driven by the defending champion, not making the grid. It was a moment that left journalists stunned and fans furious. By the end of the season, Ferrari had collected just 8 points, finishing 10th in the Constructors' Championship. For context, that put them behind teams with a fraction of their budget and history. For Ferrari, a team built on pride, passion, and dominance, 1980 wasn't just failure, it was humiliation on a global stage. Even decades later, Tifosi and historians agree, no Ferrari season has ever sunk lower. McLaren. When McLaren announced they were reuniting with Honda in 2015, the expectations were sky high. Fans remembered the golden age of Ayrton Senna and Alain Prost, when the McLaren-Honda partnership dominated Formula One with relentless efficiency. The idea was simple. History would repeat itself. But instead of glory, 2015 became the most painful year in McLaren's modern history. The MP430 car looked sleek, but under the bodywork hit a disaster. Honda's hybrid power unit was underpowered, unreliable, and years behind Mercedes. Straight-line speed was non-existent. McLaren were regularly 30 to 40 kilometers per hour, slower on the straights. Every race weekend turned into a gamble of whether Alonso or Button could even finish. The nadir came at Suzuka, Honda's home race. Fernando Alonso, sitting in the cockpit of a car that was embarrassing him lap after lap, let his frustration spill out on the radio. GP2 engine, GP2, he shouted, comparing the Honda power unit to a second-tier racing car. Those words echoed across the world. Honda executives, watching from the garage, sat in silence. The once proud partnership was reduced to ridicule. McLaren ended the season with just 27 points, 9th in the constructors' standings. For perspective, this was a team that had won races and fought for titles in almost every decade of Formula One. Now, they were struggling to beat Sauber. Alonso and Button, both world champions, looked broken. Every DNF, every weekend stranded in the midfield, was another blow to McLaren's reputation. 2015 wasn't just a bad year, it was a scar. It forced McLaren to confront the reality that history alone doesn't guarantee success. The glory days were gone, and rebuilding would take years. Fans still cite 2015 as the year that redefined the meaning of failure for one of F1's greatest teams. Williams, they once stood as giants of Formula One. 9 Constructors' Championships, 7 Drivers' titles, legends like Mansell, Prost, Senna, Hill, and Villeneuve all driving their cars. But by 2019, the Williams name had become something entirely different. A story of decline, mismanagement, and survival. The signs of collapse showed before the season even started. In February, as every other team rolled their cars out for winter testing, Williams didn't show. Days passed, and rivals racked up hundreds of laps. Williams finally arrived late, the FW42 unfinished and unrefined. George Russell, making his F1 debut, admitted the car felt wrong from the very first laps. Robert Kubica, attempting his comeback after nearly a decade away, found himself with machinery that was borderline undrivable. The performance gap was staggering. In some sessions, Williams were nearly 2 seconds slower than the next slowest team. They weren't just at the back. They were in a league of their own, a league no one wanted to be in. By mid-season, it was clear. Scoring points would take a miracle. That miracle came in Germany, where Kubica inherited 10th place after a chaotic rain race. 1 point, that was it. Across 21 Grand Prix, one single point. For a team that once ruled the sport, this was rock bottom. The FW42 wasn't just slow. It represented a complete breakdown of a team's ability to compete. Funding was tight, the car concept was flawed, and morale was shattered. Fans watched with heavy hearts as a team that once challenged Ferrari and McLaren now fought just to finish races. 2019 is remembered as the year Williams hit the floor. The proud family-run team, still under Claire Williams' management, couldn't hide from reality anymore. They were no longer contenders, no longer even midfield. They were the backmarkers, the tail-enders, the fallen giant. And while 2020 wasn't much better, it was 2019 that fans point to as the absolute nadir of Williams' history. Mercedes before the hybrid era dominance, before Hamilton's streak of titles, there was a time when Mercedes still looked like just another midfield team. 2011 was that reminder. The year the Silver Arrows had all the money, all the history, even Michael Schumacher in their car, and yet couldn't touch the podium. The W02 car was sleek in presentation, but flawed in every way that mattered. Aerodynamics were underdeveloped compared to Red Bull and McLaren, and their Mercedes engine, once the gold standard, couldn't make up for the lack of balance and grip. The car chewed through its tires on long runs, forcing drivers onto desperate strategies just to stay in the points. For Michael Schumacher, it was torture. The 7-time world champion had returned in 2010 expecting to fight for wins. But by 2011, reality had set in. The machinery simply wasn't capable. Race after race, Schumacher found himself battling Force Indias and Saubers instead of Ferraris and McLarens. For fans, seeing the greatest driver of a generation fighting for 8th place was surreal and sad. Nico Rosberg, meanwhile, drove consistently but couldn't do better than a handful of 5ths and 6th. And the number that says it all? Across 19 Grand Prix, Mercedes scored 0 podiums, not a single top 3 finish, while Red Bull and McLaren dominated. For a works team with Daimler's resources, that was humiliating. They ended the year 4th in the Constructors, behind Ferrari, closer to the midfield than the front. Looking back, 2011 stands as the turning point that forced Mercedes to rethink everything: management, engineering, and long-term planning. It's no exaggeration to say the pain of 2011 lit the fire that made them the juggernaut they became later. But at the time, all fans saw was disappointment. The mighty Silver Arrows, humbled and lost in the midfield. Red Bull, they entered Formula One as rebels and rose to dominance almost overnight. Between 2010 and 2013, they were unstoppable. 4 straight Constructors' Championships, 4 straight drivers' titles for Sebastian Vettel, and Adrian Newey's genius cemented as the best designer in the sport. But in 2015, that empire looked like it was crumbling. The problem wasn't the chassis. Newey's RB11 was decent, but it was paired with Renault's underdeveloped hybrid engine. The result was a car with no straight-line speed and a tendency to break down at the worst times. Mercedes was untouchable, Ferrari resurgent, and Red Bull found themselves dragged into battles they never imagined having to fight. Daniel Ricciardo, the team's rising star after Vettel's departure, was forced into constant damage limitation drives. Daniil Kvyat, promoted from Toro Rosso, struggled with consistency and reliability issues. DNFs piled up, and frustration grew louder with every race. The low point wasn't just on the track. It was off it. Red Bull's feud with Renault exploded publicly. Christian Horner and Helmut Marko blasted their engine supplier almost every weekend, calling the power unit unacceptable and threatening to quit Formula One entirely if things didn't improve. It was messy, political, and humiliating for a team that had been at the pinnacle only 2 years earlier. By season's end, Red Bull had salvaged 4th in the Constructors, but that number doesn't tell the full story. They weren't in the title fight. They weren't winning races, and their once fearsome aura had evaporated. For many fans, 2015 is remembered as Red Bull's lowest ebb, a season of public breakdowns, fractured relationships, and a painful reminder that dominance in Formula One can vanish almost overnight. Alpine, Renault. When Renault bought back Lotus for 2016, fans expected a rebirth. Renault Renault had history, 2 world titles with Fernando Alonso in 2005 and 2006, and as a works team, they carried the resources to challenge the best. But what actually unfolded was one of the bleakest years in their history. The RS16 car was rushed into existence, cobbled together after Renault's late takeover of the Lotus team. The chassis lacked downforce, the power unit was weak, and reliability was poor. From the very start of the season, it was obvious the team was in trouble. Jolyon Palmer, a rookie, struggled to keep the car on track, while Kevin Magnussen could only drag it into the points in chaotic races. Across the entire season, Renault scored just 8 points. 8. That was enough for 9th in the constructors' standings, ahead only of backmarkers Sauber and Manor. For a factory team with Renault's pedigree, that was nothing short of an embarrassment. The struggles weren't just mechanical. Morale in the garage was low. Engineers who had once been part of title-winning projects were now reduced to fighting for scraps. Even the yellow and black livery, meant to signal a fresh start, became a symbol of disappointment as the team trailed at the back. 2016 forced Renault into a long, painful rebuilding process. They promised fans it was a transition year, but supporters knew the truth. The gap to the front wasn't measured in tenths. It was measured in years. And while Alpine today still fights to be relevant, 2016 is remembered as the season when a works team looked indistinguishable from a struggling independent. Aston Martin, Spiker. To understand Aston Martin's lowest point, you have to go back before the green cars, before Lawrence Stroll, before the Racing Point pink machines. The team's DNA runs all the way back to Jordan in the 1990s, a team that once won races and stood on podiums. But by 2007, that proud lineage had hit absolute rock bottom under the Spiker name. The Spiker F8-7 car looked striking in orange, but that was the only thing going for it. The car was painfully slow, overweight, and aerodynamically outdated. At a time when Ferrari, McLaren, and BMW Sauber were pushing innovation in every direction, Spiker barely had the funds to keep the lights on. The engineering staff worked under impossible constraints, and the drivers, Adrian Sutil and Christijan Albers, had little chance of competing. On the track, it was brutal. Sutil, a rookie, showed flashes of talent, but was left stranded at the back almost every weekend. Albers struggled to stay relevant and eventually lost his seat mid-season after sponsorship money dried up, a sign of just how dire things were financially. The team was so desperate for funds that paying drivers became their only lifeline. The nadir came in Fuji, a rain-soaked chaos race. For a few brief moments, the orange car actually ran in the points as others spun or retired. Spiker's only point of the season came in Germany, where Marcus Winkelhock briefly led in the rain chaos before the team inherited a solitary constructor's point. One solitary point in a whole season of misery. But the results only told part of the story. Behind the scenes, the financial crisis was deepening. Spiker had overreached, stretching itself thin just to stay in Formula One, and the debts piled up. By the end of 2007, the team was sold yet again, this time becoming Force India under Vijay Mallya. The name Spiker disappeared, remembered only as a footnote, a symbol of collapse in F1's cutthroat world. For fans who trace Aston Martin's heritage back through Jordan, Midland, and Spiker, 2007 is universally remembered as the lowest valley. A once proud race-winning team reduced to begging for cash, fighting only for survival, and celebrating a single inherited point like it was a championship. Haas, for them, 2021 was supposed to be a reset year, a season sacrificed to prepare for the 2022 regulations. But what unfolded went beyond sacrifice. It was a year so barren, so joyless, that fans still call it the season Haas simply stopped existing as a racing team. From the very start, Haas admitted they would spend nothing on development. The VF21 was essentially a repainted version of their 2020 car, which hadn't been competitive to begin with. That meant the team was already 2 steps behind before the lights even went out in Bahrain. The driver lineup told the other half of the story. Gone were veterans like Romain Grosjean and Kevin Magnussen. In their place came 2 rookies, Mick Schumacher, son of the legend, carrying enormous expectations, and Nikita Mazepin, a controversial figure whose seat was secured by sponsorship money from his father. Both were thrown into the deep end, with a car that didn't even belong in Formula One's midfield. The results were as grim as expected. Haas scored 0 points all season, not one. Schumacher fought bravely, dragging the VF21 around circuits where he was often multiple seconds off the pace. His qualifying laps showed flashes of raw talent, but the car gave him nothing to work with. Mazepin, meanwhile, became infamous for constant spins, earning the cruel nickname Maze Spin from fans online. At some tracks, the Haas cars weren't just last, they were dangerously off the pace, almost in the way of the leaders when they were lapped. Morale in the garage hit rock bottom. Mechanics and engineers, who once celebrated Haas's impressive debut years, were now working endless hours just to keep the cars running. Knowing points were impossible. Even team principal Günther Steiner, usually good for a laugh with his unfiltered style, looked drained. His fiery passion was replaced with resignation. "We are where we are," he repeated throughout the season. Haas finished dead last in the constructors' standings, their only notable achievement being that they showed up. And for Formula One fans, that was the saddest part. Watching an American team, which had once promised to bring fresh energy to the grid, reduced to irrelevance. 2021 isn't remembered for glory or even for failure in the traditional sense. It's remembered as the season Haas gave up. No upgrades, no fight, no hope, just 22 races of survival, sitting at the back while the rest of the grid raced on. Racing Bulls, Toro Rosso. The contrast between 2008 and 2009 for Toro Rosso was night and day. In 2008, the small Faenza-based outfit had pulled off one of the greatest upsets in modern Formula One history. At Monza, in front of the Italian fans, Sebastian Vettel drove a Toro Rosso to victory. It was the first and only win in the team's history, and it felt like a miracle. For a junior squad meant to nurture Red Bull's talent pipeline, it was the moment they looked like a giant killer. But fairy tales in Formula One rarely last. The following year, the team was brought crashing back to reality. The STR4 car simply wasn't good enough. Built around customer Red Bull designs, but lacking the same development pace, the car struggled badly with the new aerodynamic regulations. While Red Bull's main team surged forward and became championship contenders, Toro Rosso found themselves left behind. The driver lineup reflected that instability. Sebastian Vettel was gone, promoted to the senior Red Bull squad, and in his place came Sébastien Buemi and Sébastien Bourdais. Buemi, a rookie, showed flashes of speed, but couldn't compensate for the car's flaws. Bourdais, who had made his name in American open-wheel racing, never settled in Formula One. The pairing lacked the firepower to overcome a car that was fundamentally off the pace. Week after week, Toro Rosso languished at the back of the midfield, often outqualified by smaller teams with even fewer resources. Mechanical reliability was another issue. DNFs piled up, further sapping morale. The magical aura from 2008 had evaporated. They ended the season with just 8 points, finishing 10th in the constructors' standings. What stung the most was watching Red Bull Racing, their big brother, rise to the top that same year. Vettel, the man who had delivered Toro Rosso's finest hour, was suddenly winning races for the main squad, while his old team couldn't even sniff the points. For Toro Rosso fans, 2009 was a cruel reminder of reality. The Monza miracle hadn't turned them into contenders. It had been a rare, fleeting alignment of talent and circumstance. Once that magic was gone, they were right back where the world expected them to be, a junior team fighting only to survive. That fall from glory is what makes 2009 the season everyone agrees was their worst. Sauber, their history is built on being Formula One's great survivors. Since the team's debut in 1993, they'd carved out a reputation for punching above their weight. They weren't frontrunners, but they were respected midfield fighters who occasionally delivered shock podiums. But in 2014, the first year of Formula One's turbo hybrid era, all of that came crashing down. The Ferrari-powered C33 was a disaster from the very beginning. The hybrid engines were new for everyone, but Ferrari's version was underpowered and heavy compared to the dominant Mercedes unit. Sauber didn't just suffer from lack of power. Their chassis was overweight and lacked balance. It was the perfect storm. A slow engine in a car that couldn't handle. The driver lineup of Adrian Sutil and Esteban Gutierrez had talent, but they were helpless. No matter how hard they pushed, the car had no speed in qualifying and no consistency in races. Strategy gambles went nowhere because the raw pace simply wasn't there. Weekend after weekend, Sauber's cars ran outside the points, sometimes even struggling to beat backmarkers like Caterham and Marussia. The humiliation came from the numbers. Sauber scored 0 points across 19 races. 0 row. It was the first time in their history that they failed to register a single point in a season. A team that had once stood on podiums, that had groomed drivers like Kimi Räikkönen and Felipe Massa, now looked like a shadow of itself. The consequences were severe. Finishing 10th in the constructors meant little prize money, and financially, Sauber was already stretched thin. Rumors circulated about the team's survival. Staff morale plummeted. Engineers and mechanics who had been part of Sauber's proud, overachieving years now found themselves preparing cars with no hope of competing. Fans who had followed the team since its underdog days were heartbroken. Sauber had always been the plucky privateer fighting against giants. But 2014 stripped away even that identity. They weren't fighters anymore. They were passengers at the back of the grid. Even today, when Sauber's ups and downs are discussed, 2014 remains the benchmark for failure. Not just because they scored no points, but because it symbolized a team losing its soul, outclassed, outpaced, and out of answers. For many, it was the year Sauber stopped being the lovable underdog and became just another struggling backmarker.